Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a historical paradox that completely flips everything we know about massive success. When you think about building a huge global network, you probably picture aggressive, outward-facing expansion, constantly networking and making noise, right? But the source material we're unpacking today looks at the Portuguese Empire, what we're calling the Avoidant Empire, and it reveals something wild. It shows how a deeply ingrained sense of isolation actually served as the ultimate catalyst for unprecedented, world-spanning success. It's this incredibly fascinating case study of how, sometimes, turning your back on the crowd is the exact thing that lets you conquer the globe.
Okay, let's dive into this, because asking if avoidant behavior can actually build an empire just seems like a massive contradiction right out of the gate. Traditionally, building an empire means reaching out, expanding your borders, and making sure everyone everywhere knows your name. But to understand this paradox, we have to look at the geopolitical reality of early Portugal. Basically, they were geographically boxed in on the Iberian Peninsula by their much larger, way more powerful neighbor, the group that would eventually become Spain. They were literally cut off from the rest of Europe. So this forced an avoidance stance when it came to European land politics. Instead of fighting a completely unwinnable battle for continental influence, they just turned their backs. They turned away from the crowded, noisy continent and looked out toward the massive, empty expanse of the Atlantic Ocean.
There is a really profound contrast right at the heart of this empire. On one hand, you've got a culture defined by deep introspection and this sort of melancholic turning inward. It's beautifully captured in the Portuguese concept of saudade, this profound, nostalgic longing and isolation that is literally still the beating heart of traditional fado music today. It's quiet, it's deeply personal, it is withdrawn. But that exact cultural foundation of isolation birthed a blazing reality of global outposts. We're talking a direct pipeline from the quiet, melancholic shadows of a solitary, avoidant nation straight to the loudest, most expansive, and incredibly high-speed global expansion of the 15th and 16th centuries. And that brings us to what our sources brilliantly call the loner's paradox. So how does a supposedly negative trait, being closed off and avoidant, transform into a foundational superpower? Usually, being a loner means you just get left behind while everyone else is out there making deals and expanding territory. But historically speaking, Portugal's avoidant mindset meant they intentionally bypassed the messy, chaotic land wars and all those endless political entanglements happening in mainland Europe. By just keeping to themselves and sitting out local conflicts like the 100 Years' War, they preserved their capital, their manpower, and most importantly, their focus. They essentially traded the distraction of immediate local competition for the intense, singular drive you need to look way beyond your immediate horizons.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how this distinct psychological and political detachment anchored itself into hard, undeniable geography. This avoidance strategy wasn't just some abstract theory. It resulted in massive, incredibly lucrative, gold and spice-filled global trade outposts. Because they completely bypassed the crowded, noisy markets of the Mediterranean, which, by the way, were heavily controlled by Venetian and Ottoman middlemen, Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama just cast their nets across vast, entirely uncharted oceans. And this led to establishing absolute dominance in the most far-flung, wealthy regions on Earth. We are talking about the crazy, lucrative spice routes of India, the massive sugar trade out of Brazil, and they even became the very first Europeans to establish trade relations with Japan.
And let me tell you, that distinct strategy triggered an absolute growth explosion. Once they bypassed the immediate noise of European land borders and set their sights across the oceans, they didn't just grow a little bit, they completely outpaced the world. But doing that required totally unprecedented innovation. Under the guidance of figures like Prince Henry the Navigator, they funneled all that isolated focus directly into maritime technology. They developed the caravel, which was this revolutionary ship design that could actually sail against the wind, and they mastered the incredibly complex Atlantic wind patterns known as the Volta do Mar. So, while the rest of Europe was totally bogged down and distracted by local drama, this small, isolated loner quietly weaponized its isolation to trigger a monumental, rapid surge in global exploration. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of this paradox. Just consider their geographic footprint for a second. At home, they maintained a remarkably constrained, super low-profile presence in Europe, just a tiny sliver of land on the edge of the continent. But across the ocean, that footprint absolutely exploded. After the Treaty of Tordesillas, which, audaciously enough, just divided the newly discovered world between Portugal and Spain, Portugal's influence stretched across multiple continents. The contrast is just staggering. Their avoidant behavior and small stature at home directly correlated with off-the-charts growth internationally.
Every bit of energy, resources, and innovation they saved by staying isolated locally was just entirely unleashed on the global stage.
So let's synthesize exactly what this all means with our definition of the Avoidant Empire. This isn't just some dry history lesson, guys. It is a profound historical success secret. The real key takeaway here is about the power of detachment. It proves that an avoidant mindset, or even deliberate isolation, doesn't have to be a limitation at all. In this specific case, isolation functioned as the ultimate catalyst because it completely prevented groupthink. Think about it. When you are cut off from the conventional ways of doing things, you are absolutely forced to innovate out of pure necessity. Portugal didn't succeed in spite of being isolated from Europe. They succeeded because it gave them the unique perspective to look out toward the sea while everyone else was busy fighting over the land.
Which brings us to the ultimate conclusion, the loner's superpower. This exact phrase from our source material perfectly captures the energy of this paradox. By straight up refusing to play the same crowded, noisy game as everyone else, Portugal unlocked a completely different level of achievement. The ability to stand apart, to actually be comfortable in the shadows of isolation, became their ultimate strategic advantage. In fact, this loner strategy was so insanely effective that the Portuguese Empire became not only the very first global empire in history, but also the longest-lived modern European empire, spanning nearly 600 years. Literally, they claimed the bright gold of the world simply by refusing to fight over the dirt in their own backyard.
So it really makes you think, how might isolation be a hidden advantage in your own life? We are constantly told to network more, be louder, hustle, and push ourselves right into the center of the crowd. But looking at the massive 6th century success of the Avoidant Empire, perhaps there is profound value in just stepping back. Maybe avoiding the immediate noise, embracing a period of quiet introspection, and refusing to engage in all those messy entanglements right next door is the exact catalyst you need to find your own uncharted ocean. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will see you next time.